This is a story about Petey the Snake. He was a young snake, and he had to practice his hissing. So he practiced hissing in the pit all the time. And he was hissing in his pit, and his mama came home and said, "Petey, I am sick and tired of hearing you hiss in our pit. Go practice your hissing someplace else. Go to Mrs. Potts' pit and hiss. I don't think she's at home." So Petey left, and he went over to Mrs. Potts' pit, and sure enough, Mrs. Potts wasn't home in her pit, so he went on in, and he was in there hissing in her pit, just practicing. Mrs. Potts came home, and she said, "Petey, why are you hissing in my pit?" And he said, "Well, I was hissing at my pit, and Mama said she was tired of hearing me hiss in the pit to come over to Mrs. Potts' pit and hiss, so I came over here because you weren't home." And she said, "Well, Petey, I don't want you to hiss in my pit anymore. You go home and hiss in your own pit." So Petey went home, and he was in there hissing in his pit. And his mother said, "Petey, why are you here hissing in our pit? I told you to go to Mrs. Potts' pit and hiss." He said, "I did go to Mrs. Potts' pit and hiss. I practiced hissing." And she came home and said, "Petey, why are you here?" "Well, my mama got here tired of hearing me hiss in our pit and told me to go to Mrs. Potts' pit and hiss. And she says, 'Well, I don't want you to hiss in my pit. Go home and hiss in your own pit.' So here I am." And she says, "Well, that really makes me mad. I knew Mrs. Potts when she didn't have a pit to hiss in."
Woo! There ain't no way I'd say that. I'm going to get the first line.